There are certain rooms in your life you build for one person only. You furnish them with patience, you wallpaper them with inside jokes, you install windows just to let in the specific quality of light that makes them look their best. For 8 years, my friendship with Alex was a cathedral I had built in my own heart, a vast and quiet space where I was the sole, silent worshiper. I never expected him to come inside, let alone ask to stay. And I certainly never expected him to be the one to point out that I had never built a room for anyone else. He asked the question on a Tuesday in November, the kind of evening that felt like a held breath, caught between the memory of autumn and the threat of winter. Rain slicked the city streets into black mirrors outside my window, and inside, the only light came from the muted television and a single, low-wattage lamp in the corner. He was sprawled on my couch, a familiar fixture in the geography of my apartment, his head resting on a cushion near my knee. We had been sitting like that for hours, cocooned in a silence that had become its own language between us, when his voice, low and slightly rough from the late hour, cut through the quiet. "Why haven't you ever really dated anyone, Liam?" The question landed not with a crash, but with the disquieting softness of a stone dropping into a deep well. I felt the ripples expand through me, disturbing years of settled silence. My entire body became a study in stillness. I was a photographer by trade, a professional observer, and I had spent the better part of a decade observing him. I knew the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating, the exact rhythm of his breathing as he drifted toward sleep, the way he'd unconsciously traced the seams on the sofa cushions with his thumb. But I had built formidable walls to keep him from observing me, from seeing the one truth that colored my entire world. My feelings for him were a fundamental part of my architecture, a load-bearing wall I could never remove without bringing the whole structure of my life down around me. To understand the weight of his question, you have to understand the foundation it rested upon. I met Alex our freshman year of college. I was hiding behind my camera, using the lens as a shield, a justifiable reason to be present but not participating. He was the opposite, a force of nature, all easy smiles and gravitational charm that pulled people into his orbit. He wasn't just popular. He was genuinely liked, for a kindness that felt neither performed nor accidental. Our friendship began with a photograph. I caught a candid shot of him laughing, head thrown back, sunlight catching in his hair. It was an unguarded moment of pure joy, and when I showed it to him, he didn't just thank me. He studied it, and then he studied me, with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time, seen rather than just looked at. He saw the person behind the camera, not just the images I produced. From there, a bond formed, confounding all of our mutual friends. The quiet, introverted arts student and the outgoing, life-of-the-party business major. But it worked. He drew me out of my shell, and I, in turn, offered him a quiet harbor from the relentless energy of his own life. He'd come to my dorm, and later my apartment, to decompress, to escape the noise. My space became his sanctuary, and over the years, my quiet admiration bloomed into a deep and intractable love. It was a love I nurtured in secret, a hidden garden I tended alone. It was patient and undemanding. I accepted that my role in his life was that of the steadfast friend, the calm center. I watched him date, fall in love, and fall out of love. I was the person he called for advice, the one who listened to him talk about his relationships with a series of bright, lovely women. Each conversation was a small, sharp pain, a reminder of the unbridgeable distance between the room I had built for him and the life he was building for himself. I learned to compartmentalize, to lock that part of myself away so securely I sometimes forgot it was there until a moment like this, him, quiet and close in the near dark, would remind me of its constant, humming presence. My friendship with him was the most significant relationship of my life, and the thought of risking it, of destabilizing that perfect, fragile thing with the weight of my truth, was unthinkable. So I stayed silent. I became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance. The shift began about 6 months before that night on the couch. It started with a phone call, late on a Sunday. Alex's voice was hollowed out, a mere echo of its usual warmth. He and Sarah, his girlfriend of 3 years, the one everyone thought he would marry, had broken up. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive end, but a slow, quiet erosion, which he said was somehow worse. He told me, like his future had just been professionally demolished, leaving behind nothing but dust and a vacant lot. He wasn't just heartbroken. He was profoundly lost, unmoored from the life he had been so certain he was sailing toward. That was when he started showing up, not with the casual, just in the neighborhood ease of before, but with a different kind of urgency, a palpable need. He would appear at my door after long days at his consulting job, his suit slightly rumpled, his tie loosened, looking like a man who had been navigating a storm and had just now found port. He never needed to say much. I would just open the door, and he would drift inside, shedding the armor of his day as he went. He was seeking something more than company. He was seeking stillness, my stillness. And so, the ritual began. It was an unspoken, unacknowledged choreography of comfort. He would sink into the old armchair or stretch out on the couch, and I would put on a record or an old movie, something to fill the space so the silence didn't feel so heavy. At first, he would talk, circling the drain of his breakup, trying to diagnose what went wrong. I would listen, offering what little I could. But as the weeks wore on, the talking lessened. The need was no longer for analysis, but for simple presence. He just needed not to be alone in his own cavernous apartment, a space that had once been shared and was now haunted by absence. One night, exhausted from a long flight back from a business trip, he fell asleep on the couch while I was working on some photo edits at the dining table. I found him there hours later, curled into himself, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. I fetched a blanket from the linen closet and draped it over him. It felt like a transgression, a crossing of some invisible line. My fingers brushed his shoulder, and a current, sharp and stunning, went through me. I retreated, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I told myself it was just friendship, just care. But I knew it was more. It felt like a prayer whispered into a void. I left him there and went to my own bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was too aware of him, of his breathing, just one thin wall away. This became the new pattern. He'd come over, we'd fall into our comfortable quiet, and more often than not, he would fall asleep on the couch. I'd offered him the guest room dozens of times. You know you can just stay, Alex. The bed's always made. He'd always smile, a tired, grateful smile, and say, I know. Thanks, Liam. Maybe next time, but he never did. He always chose the couch, in the main room, closer to me. It was a space that maintained a fiction of impermanence, of accidental closeness. Taking the guest room would have been an admission, an intentional act of staying the night. The couch was a gray area, a place of plausible deniability for us both. For him, it meant he wasn't imposing. For me, it meant I could pretend this agonizing proximity wasn't the most important thing in my world. Every night he stayed was a masterclass in controlled breathing for me. I became a scholar of subtle sounds. The sigh he'd let out as he finally relaxed, the soft rustle of the blanket as he shifted, the faint, rhythmic puff of his breath. I would lie awake in my own room, the door left slightly ajar, listening. That open door became a symbol of my own agonizing hope. It was an invitation I could deny I was even offering. The space between my bedroom and the living room was charged with everything I could never say. It was 100 feet of frayed nerve endings. I was terrified he would one day walk through it, and even more terrified that he never would. I was living in a state of suspended animation, drowning in a sea of unspoken things, and the nearness of him was my only oxygen. The ritual was both my greatest comfort and my most exquisite torture. And that brought us back to the Tuesday in November, to the rain and the lamplight and the question hanging in the air between us. Why haven't you ever really dated anyone, Liam? I tried to conjure a casual answer, something light and dismissive that would gently redirect the conversation back to safer shores. My mind was a frantic scramble of possibilities. I could say I was focused on my career. I could say I just hadn't met the right person. I could make a joke, but my throat was tight, the words trapped behind the lump of my long-held secret. I settled for a half-truth that was also a kind of lie. It's complicated, I managed to say, my voice quieter than I intended. I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen, where silent, flickering images played out a drama I wasn't watching. Alex was silent for a long time after that. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more meaningful than our usual quiet. It was an active silence, a thinking silence. I could feel his gaze on me, and I resisted the powerful urge to look at him. I felt like one of my own photographs, pinned and examined, every detail exposed in the stark light of his focus. I braced myself for a follow-up question, for more prodding, but it didn't come. Instead, when he finally spoke again, his voice was different. It was stripped of all artifice, raw and unbearably soft. "I wish you'd chosen me." The words were so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined them, a phantom echo of my own deepest yearning. But they were real. They hung in the air, luminous and terrifying. My breath hitched. I finally turned to look at him. He had pushed himself up slightly. His eyes, dark and deep in the dim light, were fixed on mine. There was no trace of his usual easygoing confidence. In its place was a fragile, open-hearted vulnerability that mirrored my own. He looked scared. He looked honest. He had said chosen, as if it were a choice I had failed to make, rather than a choice I never believed I had. The room I built for him. He was standing at the door, not asking for the key, but telling me he wished I had given it to him all along. My mind was white noise. The carefully constructed walls of my self-preservation crumbled to dust. There were no more words, no more deflections, no more safe distances. There was only the inches between us, charged with 8 years of unspoken history and one impossible, earth-shattering sentence. He didn't move. He just watched me, waiting. And in his waiting, he was giving me the choice. Stay silent, and let the moment pass into the realm of things we would pretend never happened. Or answer. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Instead, I let my own gaze be my reply, letting him see the flood of emotion I had kept dammed up for so long. I let him see the shock, the fear, and underneath it all, the vast, oceanic depth of my affection. It was the most honest I had ever been with him. A slow understanding dawned in his expression, followed by a flicker of something like relief. He shifted, moving with a slow, deliberate tentativeness, closing the small gap between us. He stopped when his knee brushed against mine, a small point of contact that felt like an anchor in a raging sea. "Liam," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Would it be okay?" I knew what he was asking, and I could only nod, a single, jerky movement. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, and the first touch of his lips to mine was not a passionate claiming, but a question. It was hesitant, gentle, and profoundly sad, like a confession of a long-held sorrow. It was the softest collision, and it shattered me completely, breaking me open in the most beautiful, terrifying way. I answered his kiss with my own, a release of pressure that had been building for nearly a decade. It wasn't about desire, not then. It was about recognition. It was about finally coming home. The aftermath was a landscape of confusion. I woke the next morning to an empty apartment. The blanket was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. The coffee pot was cold. Alex was gone. There was no note. It was as if the entire night, the confession, the kiss, had been a dream I'd had in the rain-soaked quiet. But the ghost of his presence lingered, a phantom warmth on the sofa cushions, the memory of his lips a brand on mine. My hope, which had soared to such dizzying heights, plummeted. A cold, familiar dread began to seep into its place. I had misread everything. I was a moment of confused comfort for him, a temporary solace in his loneliness. He had woken up in the clear light of day and regretted it. My texts to him over the next few days were met with short, delayed replies. Busy at work, swamped, talk later. He was building a wall, brick by painful brick, between us. The easy intimacy we had shared for years vanished, replaced by a formal, aching distance. He was avoiding me, and with every unanswered call, every terse message, the beautiful, fragile thing that had happened between us began to feel ugly and shameful. The silence that had once been our sanctuary was now a weapon he was using to keep me at bay. The hurt was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache in my chest. But underneath the hurt, a slow-burning anger began to kindle. It wasn't his confusion I was angry at, it was his cowardice. He had opened a door in me, and then he had fled, leaving me standing alone in the wreckage. After a week of this agonizing radio silence, I knew I couldn't let it lie. I couldn't let our friendship, our history, die this slow, undignified death. I went to his apartment. I stood outside his door, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I knocked. It took him a long time to answer. When he finally opened the door, he looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He stepped aside wordlessly. His apartment was immaculate and sterile, a hotel room someone happened to be living in. It lacked all the warmth and lived in comfort of my own place. It was the space of a man who was never truly at rest. "Alex," I started, turning to face him. "What are we doing?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, frantic conflict. "I don't know, Liam," he said, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I shouldn't have. It was a mistake." The word mistake hit me like a physical blow. "A mistake," I repeated, the anger finally flaring. "The kiss, or saying what you said? Or all of it? You can't just say something like that, something you have to know would change everything, and then disappear. You don't get to do that. Not to me." "I know," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I'm so confused. My whole life I've had this plan, this picture of what it's supposed to look like. And you were my friend. My best friend. You were the one constant, the one safe place. And that night, I just looked at you, and I realized I was lonelier with Sarah than I ever was sitting in silence with you. And it scared the hell out of me, because it didn't fit the plan. It doesn't fit who I thought I was." He was pacing now, a caged animal in his own pristine living room. "And then I kissed you, and it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in years. And that scared me even more. So I ran. Because I'm a coward." His confession, raw and painful as it was an anchor. It was the truth. It wasn't that he didn't feel it. It was that he was terrified that he did. The anger in me subsided, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't just confused. He was dismantling his own identity, and he was doing it alone. I walked over to him and gently put my hands on his shoulders, stopping his frantic pacing. "Hey," I said softly. "Look at me." He did, his gaze uncertain. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You just have to stop running. Talk to me. Let me in." His defenses crumbled. A shudder went through his body, and he leaned his forehead against mine, closing his eyes. "I don't know how," he breathed. "You start," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "by staying." And he did. We stood there for a long time, in the middle of his sterile apartment, just breathing together. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't an absence or an evasion. It was a space we were intentionally creating, a foundation we could start to build something new upon. We began to talk, really talk, for hours. I told him about the years of quiet affection, about the room I had built. He told me about his gnawing loneliness, his feeling of performing a life rather than living it, and how my quiet presence had been the only authentic thing he'd had. It was a conversation of excavation, of carefully unearthing years of buried feelings. We are still building. It is a slow and deliberate process, marked not by grand gestures, but by small, intentional acts of presence. He stays over now, but he no longer sleeps on the couch. The guest room door remains closed. He sleeps in my bed, beside me, his steady breathing the new rhythm of my nights. The mornings are quiet. He'll stand next to me as I make coffee, his warmth a comforting presence at my side. We are learning a new language together, one spoken not just in words, but in shared space, in quiet understanding, in the simple, profound act of choosing to stay. There are rooms you build in your life, thinking they are only for you. You imagine them as solitary places, safe from the complexities of the world. But sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, the person you built it for walks in, looks around, and doesn't just see the architecture of your love. They see a place where they can finally set down their own burdens, a place they can call home. We stopped trying to understand it with logic and plans. We simply began to live in it, healing in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.